This book has me thinking a lot about the unmasculinity of love. All About Love by Bell Hooks. Let's talk about it. This is actually the third book that I read by Bell Hooks. I first read The Will to Change and then Teaching to Transgress, which I've discussed in other videos, but I finally this break got around to reading All About Love, and I was amazed at how hard I had to fight to even listen to what she was saying because of all the nonsense that was stuck in my head as I was reading it. In fact, when I was texting a friend about it, I said to her that it was not as intellectual as the other books of hers that I've read. Why is a text about love feeling like it's necessarily less intellectual than books about pedagogy or books about cultural criticism? To be fair to myself and my own reaction, there are a lot of things in this book that are more about faith and spirituality than in these two texts. So if she's not doing theology and she's like leaning on concepts of faith, it can feel like that's less intellectual because she's not like making arguments for the things that she's saying in some of the chapters. From high fantasy to indigenous science to pure bioethics to American history, I've recommended a lot of different kinds of books on this channel, and I don't normally talk about books that have components that have to do with faith. So as I was reading it, I sort of just tried to do the thing that Hans-Georg Gadamer says, which is to have hermeneutics of charity, to read charitably instead of dismissing the entire text because there were things that I disagreed with. And it is kind of an aside, but it's a worthy aside. Like, learning to read charitably is so important that I'm perfectly willing to pause my plan to cite Cheryl Strayed in response to questions I had about bell hooks. Hans-Georg Gadamer was a German philosopher who was extremely influential in my upbringing as a young nerd, and he doesn't just say you ought to interpret what people say charitably because he wants to be nice. He hooked me as a kid because he made an argument for why it is rational to interpret what other people are saying charitably, and it's this. If you have something to learn from someone, their definitions and their worldview is going to be different from yours, sort of by definition. And so when you're listening to them make an argument in your presence, you will hear what they are saying as irrational if you do not understand the worldview that they are trying to convince you of. Imagine your friend comes to you and says, you really, the best kind of mammals are the ones with no legs. And you're like, that is an irrational thing that you just said that does not make any sense. But like, they're really adamant about it. And they're like, no, you don't understand. You need to understand that the best mammals are the mammals with no legs at all. And you're like, that isn't a thing. You are speaking nonsense. From a philosophical point of view, to some extent, you are reasonable in your argument that that guy is saying something irrational. And so in the philosophical pursuit of truth, it is reasonable for you to dismiss what that person is saying. They've said an irrational thing. I'm not going to internalize it as part of my worldview until you remember the existence of dolphins and whales. So to say that a slightly different way, someone with a different worldview than you is going to have different definitions of the words that they are using than you do. And if you conceptualize mammals as only existing on land, then you are correct in your saying that they are irrational. But you, in your job of listening to them, part of what it is rational to do is to try to redefine your own terminology so that what they are saying makes sense. As I'm reading bell hooks and there's things in it that don't make sense, it is my job as a person who's reading and trying to understand new worldviews to redefine my own concepts of love in order for what she is saying to make sense. That is the essence of what it means to interpret things charitably. And that is not easy, because if you are on team mammals only have 4 legs and you've never heard of a dolphin before, you've never seen the ocean, you're gonna be confused and you're gonna think that you are correct in your rejection of what someone else is saying. It is only when you have understood someone's argument on its own terms that you have the epistemic authority to reject it in the first place. Some examples, like I've talked about, love is a word that means lots of different things to lots of different people. Another word that means different things to different people is masculinity. What definitions of the word masculinity are required for me to think of love as unmasculine and unserious? This video is already a little longer than I wanted it to be, so we'll just pick 2 of the things. First is that we often think of love as a feeling, and feeling seems to be in opposition to or in a rejection of rationality. Now, we just had a long discussion on words and their definitions, so it's worth noting that feelings and reason do not need to be in conflict with each other, even though they often are in conflict with each other. Not all squares are rectangles, but all rectangles are squares. That's not right. I did it backwards. You know what I mean. Actually, it's possible you don't know what I mean. I shouldn't assume you know what I mean. Well, that example, rectangles. Every square is a rectangle because a rectangle is two parallel lines and two more other parallel lines. So every single square that you have is going to be a rectangle. But not every rectangle that you have is going to be a square. Squares are special. Squares are a special case where the parallel lines and the other parallel lines happen to be the same. So not all squares are rectangles. All squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. The same thing can be said about feelings and reason. The fact that sometimes reason and feelings are in conflict with each other does not mean that you can necessarily conclude that they are always in conflict with each other. So if you grew up in a patriarchal society and your concept of masculinity is that part of the definition of masculinity is that it is about rejecting feelings, get that away from us. If you think that masculinity is about rejecting feelings and feelings are a component of love, then it is a reasonable thing for you to conclude that that love is an unmasculine thing. This video's ridiculous. The other component of love is that it is often relationship based. If your concept of masculinity is rugged individualism oriented, then it makes reasonable sense for you to reject this as an unmasculine thing. Saying that a little slower and less excitedly, often our concepts of masculinity require us to not reach out for help. Liz Plank, in her book For the Love of Men, gives examples of how men often end up homeless more often because they are unwilling to ask for help from the people in their lives. And housing isn't the whole story, because masculinity often requires us to refuse to ask for help, and it often socially punishes us when we do ask for help. The rate of suicide is higher in men. If you want to read more details about this, the chapter in part 2 of Liz Plank's book, If Patriarchy is So Great, Why Is It Making You Die, is an extremely moving, data-based reality check for men right now. So where are we and how do we wrap this up? My original plan was to cite Cheryl Strayed's book, Tiny Beautiful Things, the chapter called The Lusty Broad, where she talks about the synthesis of reason and feelings. And I can't give you the entire thing, but here's a quote from a poem from Adrienne Rich. The poem is so good that Cheryl Strayed quoted it, and now I'm quoting Cheryl Strayed quoting it at you. The last two lines of the poem are, I choose to love this time for once, with all my intelligence. I choose to love this time for once, with all my intelligence. To break from the YouTuber persona for a minute, if you watching this are in a headspace where your mental health is so bad that it has become a risk to your physical safety, you should reach out for help right now. I'll add the number to the description. The loneliness that you feel is manufactured, and it is our job to dismantle it. And we need you here to do that. My original plan to end this video was to just sort of break down like feelings. It's irrational to say that feelings are not part of masculinity because we anger's a feeling and we gotcha and like relationships. I was just gonna do a bunch of gotcha arguments, and nobody loves a gotcha argument, so I would rather do this. The final philosophical thing to say is something called the reductio ad absurdum. If in all this talk of defining words, if your definition of masculinity requires you to reject love, then you have created an absurd definition of masculinity. Society, since broadly construed birth control and women entering the workforce, society has allowed women to embrace traditionally masculine roles. They can be bosses. They can be in charge. They can be in sports. They can do a whole lot of different things. But we have yet to get to the point where we allow men to embrace what has traditionally been defined as feminine. And it is killing us. I'm going to be late to an event. I'm going to a thing that my friend is putting on, being vague on purpose, but hey, community building. That's what we're talking about in the next book. I finished The Service Berry, which came after Braiding Sweetgrass, and these two books about community building, jive with our concepts of relationships and feelings. Okay, bye.